The morning light filtered through the crystal towers of Verdania City, casting rainbow patterns across the peaceful streets below. The Cathari people moved slowly through their daily routines, their translucent bodies catching the light like living gems. They had lived on Keth 7 for 300 years without knowing war, without understanding violence, without ever needing to raise a weapon against another living being. Elder Finn stood at the highest observation deck of the Central Council building, watching the mining crews head out to the crystal fields. The Cathari were known throughout the galaxy for their gentle nature and their skill with crystalline energy harvesting. Their delicate bodies could barely handle their own planet's mild gravity, but they had built a civilization based on peace and cooperation. The first sign of trouble came as a shadow across the sun. Finn looked up to see massive ships blocking out the light, their hulls dark and menacing against the pale sky. Warning sirens began to wail across the city as the Cathari emergency systems detected the approaching threat. Unknown vessels, this is Verdania traffic control, came the frightened voice over the communication channels. You are entering restricted airspace. Please identify yourselves and state your intentions. The response came in the form of energy beams that turned the traffic control tower into molten slag. The Ravik Syndicate had arrived, and they had not come to negotiate. The Ravik were everything the Cathari were not. Where the Cathari were fragile and peaceful, the Ravik were armored and violent. Their reptilian bodies were built for war, covered in natural armor plates that could deflect most small arms fire. They lived for conquest and destruction. Moving from world to world like a plague of locusts, Warlord Kresh stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the orbital bombardment begin. His scarred face showed satisfaction as the first crystal towers began to fall. Remember, he told his officers, we are not here just for the crystals. We are here to send a message to the galaxy. No one can hide from the Ravik Syndicate. Down on the planet's surface, the gentle Cathari people ran in panic through streets that had never known violence. Their crystalline bodies shattered easily when debris fell from the sky. They had no weapons, no military, no way to defend themselves against the horror that had descended upon their world. Elder Finn watched from his tower as his people died in the streets below. With shaking hands, he activated the emergency communication system and began broadcasting on all galactic frequencies. This is Elder Finn of the Cathari Council on Keth 7. We are under attack by unknown forces. We request immediate humanitarian aid. We need medical supplies, food, and peacekeeping forces. Please, anyone who can hear this, we are a peaceful people. We have no weapons, no army. We need help. The message traveled across the galaxy at the speed of light, bouncing from relay station to relay station. Most who received it filed it away as another routine distress call from a minor world. But at the Terran Colonial Defense Network headquarters, Commander Walsh read the message with growing concern. Walsh had been a soldier for 30 years, fighting in the frontier wars against separatist forces and alien raiders. He had seen enough combat to recognize the signs of a massacre in the making. The Cathari were describing systematic destruction, not a simple raid. Sir, his aide said, looking up from his console, we've got more details coming in from the Keth 7 system. Multiple ships, orbital bombardment, mass civilian casualties. The Cathari are asking for negotiators and medical supplies, but this looks like a full military assault. Walsh studied the tactical display showing the Keth 7 system. The nearest Terran vessel was the TCS Retribution, a heavy assault carrier. Returning from a successful campaign against pirates in the Outer Rim, the ship was carrying 3 companies of colonial marines, battle-hardened veterans who had just finished pacifying a rebel stronghold. The Cathari are asking for aid workers and diplomats, Walsh said slowly. But what they need is a rescue operation. He turned to his communications officer. Get me Captain Brooks on the Retribution. Priority 1. The connection took several minutes to establish across the vast distances of space. When Captain Brooks' face appeared on the screen, Walsh could see the weariness in his eyes. The man had been fighting for 6 months straight, leading his Marines through some of the bloodiest battles of the war. Captain, I'm redirecting your mission. Proceed immediately to the Keth 7 system. We have a situation there that requires immediate attention. Brooks listened as Walsh explained the situation. The Cathari distress call, the apparent genocide. In progress, the request for humanitarian aid. When Walsh finished, Brooks was quiet for a long moment. Sir, my Marines are trained for combat operations, not humanitarian missions. Are you sure we're the right choice for this? Walsh looked at the tactical display again, showing the Ravik fleet surrounding the defenseless Cathari world. Captain, sometimes the most humanitarian thing you can do is stop the people causing the humanitarian crisis. The Cathari asked for aid, but what they're going to get is 3 companies of the finest soldiers in the galaxy. Make it count. Brooks nodded grimly. Understood, sir. We'll be there in 18 hours. As the Retribution changed course toward Keth 7, its crew began preparations for what they all knew would be a difficult mission. The Marines cleaned their weapons and checked their armor, while the ship's medical teams prepared for mass casualties. They were not aid workers or diplomats, but they were the only help the Cathari were going to get. In the ship's briefing room, Brooks addressed his company commanders. Gentlemen, we're going into a situation where civilians are being systematically murdered. The locals asked for peacekeepers and medical supplies. Instead, they're getting us. I don't know what we're going to find when we get there, but I know one thing for certain. When we leave, those civilians will be safe. The 3 commanders nodded. They had served under Brooks for years, fighting in dozens of battles across the galaxy. They knew their captain and they knew their Marines. The Cathari had asked for aid, but they were about to receive something far more effective. The protection of soldiers who had made violence into an art form, who understood that sometimes the only way to save innocent lives was to take guilty ones. As the Retribution jumped to hyperspace, racing toward the distant Keth 7 system, the Cathari continued to broadcast their desperate pleas for help. They had no idea that their salvation was already on the way, carried by warriors who would soon teach the galaxy that there were some lines that should never be crossed. The TCS Retribution dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Keth 7 system, and Captain Brooks felt his stomach tighten at what he saw on the tactical display. The beautiful crystal world was burning. Ravak ships surrounded the planet like vultures, their weapons systematically destroying everything on the surface that had taken the Cathari centuries to build. Sir, the sensor officer reported, I'm reading massive energy signatures from the planet's surface. The orbital bombardment has been continuous for the past 6 hours. Most of the major cities are gone. Brooks watched the display in grim silence. The Cathari had asked for humanitarian aid, for doctors and negotiators to help them deal with what they thought was a manageable crisis. Instead, they were getting colonial Marines who specialized in killing people who deserved to die. Launch. The recon teams, Brooks ordered. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with down there. Lieutenant Davies led the first recon team toward the planet's surface in a stealth dropship. The young officer had fought in the frontier wars, but nothing had prepared him for what he saw as they descended through the smoke-filled atmosphere. The crystal cities that should have sparkled like jewels were now twisted ruins. Fires burned everywhere, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with the heat of destruction. Control, this is Recon 1, Davies reported over the comm system. The situation is worse than we thought. This isn't a raid or a territorial dispute. This is systematic extermination. The dropship set down in what had once been the central plaza of Verdania City. Davies and his team moved carefully through the rubble, their sensors scanning for signs of life. What they found made even these battle-hardened soldiers pause in shock. The Ravik hadn't just been destroying the city. They had been hunting the Cathari like animals, chasing them through the streets and killing them for sport. Bodies lay scattered everywhere, their crystalline forms shattered like broken glass. Some showed signs of torture, others had been killed, while trying to protect their young. Sir, Sergeant Mills called out, his voice tight with controlled anger. You need to see this. Davies followed Mills to what had once been a hospital. The building had been deliberately targeted, its medical facilities destroyed. But in the basement they found something that made their blood run cold. The walls were covered with trophies, crystalline fragments that the Ravok had taken from their victims and arranged in patterns like decorations. Animals, Mills whispered. They're not even pretending this is about resources or territory? They're enjoying this. Davies was about to respond when his motion sensors detected movement in the ruins nearby. The Marines took defensive positions, weapons ready, but what emerged from the rubble were not Ravok raiders. Instead, a group of Cathari survivors stumbled into the plaza, their bodies weak and their movements desperate. The Cathari stopped when they saw the armored humans, fear evident in their large, gentle eyes. They had never seen beings like these before, creatures that moved with deadly precision, whose every gesture spoke of controlled violence. Where the Cathari were fragile and peaceful, these humans radiated a predatory energy that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Elder Finn stepped forward from among the survivors, his crystalline body reflecting the strange light of the burning city. "Please," he said in his musical voice, "we called for help. Are you here to negotiate with them? To make them stop?" Davies removed his helmet, revealing a face marked by years of combat. His eyes were hard, but there was something protective in his expression. "No, Elder, we're not here to negotiate. We're here to stop them." The Cathari looked confused. They had asked for aid workers and diplomats, for people who could talk to the Ravok and convince them to leave. The concept of solving problems through violence was foreign to their peaceful nature. "I don't understand," Finn said. "How will you stop them if not through negotiation?" Davies looked at the trophies on the hospital walls, at the broken bodies of innocent civilians scattered through the streets. "Elder, some people can't be reasoned with. Some people only understand one language and we speak it fluently." More Cathari survivors began to emerge from hiding places throughout the city. They moved carefully, staying close to the walls, their bodies trembling with fear and exhaustion. Many were injured, their crystalline forms cracked and bleeding. A clear, luminescent fluid, the Marines immediately began providing medical aid, but it was clear that these survivors were in terrible condition. Many had been hiding for days without food or water, too afraid to venture out as the Ravok patrols hunted them through the ruins. "How many of you are left?" Davies asked gently. Finn's voice was barely a whisper. "We had 2 million people in. This city alone? Now, perhaps a few thousand survive across the entire planet." The Marines exchanged glances. They had seen genocide before, but never on this scale. The Ravok had managed to destroy an entire civilization in a matter of days simply because they could. "Sir," Mills said over the private comm channel, "we need to get these people somewhere safe before we start the main operation." Davies nodded. "Agreed. But first, I want to know exactly what we're dealing with." He turned to Finn. "Elder, tell me about the Ravok. How many of them are there? What kind of weapons do they have?" Finn described what he had seen, hundreds of Ravok warriors armed with energy weapons and protected by natural armor. They moved in organized groups, systematically clearing each section of the city. Their ships provided orbital support, making it impossible for the Cathari to mount any kind of resistance. "They're not just killing us," Finn said, his voice breaking. "They're enjoying it. They hunt us like we're some kind of game. They take pieces of our bodies as trophies and display them like art." Davies felt a cold fury building in his chest. He had fought many enemies in his career, but there was something particularly disgusting about soldiers who took pleasure in killing civilians. "Elder, I need you to gather all the survivors you can find and get them to a secure location. My team is going to go hunting." The Cathari looked confused again. "Hunting? But you're only 4 people." "There are hundreds of them." Davies smiled grimly as he put his helmet back on. "Elder, you asked for aid workers and diplomats. Instead, you got colonial Marines. We don't negotiate with murderers, we eliminate them." As the recon team prepared to move out, Davies sent a message back to the Retribution. "Control, this is Recon 1. The situation is confirmed genocide. The Cathari are being systematically exterminated for sport. Request immediate deployment of all assault companies." Captain Brooks' response was immediate. Understood, Lieutenant. All companies are authorized for immediate deployment. Rules of engagement are weapons-free, no quarter. The Cathari had asked for help, and help was coming. But it wasn't the kind of help they had expected. Instead of aid workers and negotiators, they were getting soldiers who understood that sometimes the most humanitarian act was the complete destruction of those who preyed upon the innocent Dot as Davies and his team moved out into the burning city. The Cathari survivors watched them go with a mixture of fear and hope. They had never seen beings like these humans before, creatures who seemed to embrace violence as a tool of protection rather than destruction. The Ravik had made a fatal mistake. They had assumed that by targeting a peaceful species they would face no real resistance. But the Cathari had called for help, and the predators who had answered their call were about to teach the galaxy that there were some lines that should never be crossed. The assault companies landed under cover of darkness, their dropships descending through the smoke-filled atmosphere like metal angels of death. Captain Brooks had given his orders clearly. The Cathari were to be protected, the survivors were to be evacuated, and the Ravik Syndicate was to be eliminated completely. The Marines moved through the ruined city with practiced efficiency, their night vision systems turning the darkness into day. They had fought in urban environments before, but this was different. This wasn't a battle between armies. This was extermination duty, and they approached it with the cold professionalism that had made them the most feared fighting force in the galaxy. Sergeant Mills led his squad through the twisted remains of what had once been a Cathari cultural center. The building's crystal walls had been shattered, leaving razor-sharp fragments scattered across the floor. In the center of the room, the Marines found something that made their blood run cold. A group of Revok soldiers had set up a temporary camp, and they were using Cathari survivors as entertainment. The gentle aliens were forced to fight each other while the Ravik placed bets on the outcome. Those who refused to fight were tortured until they complied or died. Mills raised his hand, and his squad took positions around the room. The Ravok were so focused on their cruel game that they never noticed the predators closing in on them. Ravok soldiers, Mills announced over his suit's external speakers, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had seen too much war. You will release the prisoners and surrender immediately. The Ravik commander, a scarred veteran named Thek, looked up from his betting pool and laughed. Surrender? To 4 soldiers? We are 20 warriors of the mighty Ravik Syndicate. You will be our new entertainment. Mill's response was swift and merciless. The engagement lasted exactly 37 seconds. When it ended, 20 Ravik soldiers lay dead, and the 4 Marines hadn't suffered a single casualty. The Cathari survivors stared in shock at the efficiency of the killing, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. It's over, Mills said gently to the traumatized aliens. You're safe now. But the Cathari didn't look safe. They looked terrified, not just of the Ravik, but of the humans who had just killed 20 armed soldiers with such casual efficiency. These weren't the aid workers and diplomats they had asked for. These were apex predators, who had turned warfare into an art form across the city. Similar scenes were playing out as the Marine companies systematically hunted down Ravik patrols. The pirates had expected resistance from the Cathari, perhaps some hastily assembled militia with mining equipment. What they encountered instead defied their understanding of warfare. The humans fought with a calculated brutality that seemed to flow from their very nature. They didn't just defeat the Ravik, they demoralized them, turning the pirates' own tactics against them with surgical precision. They used the environment as a weapon, set traps with the patience of natural hunters, and seemed to anticipate their enemies' moves before they made them. Lieutenant Davies and his team had tracked a Ravik patrol to the ruins of a Cathari nursery. The pirates had been using the facility as a base of operations, and they had decorated it with their trophies, crystalline fragments taken from their victims and arranged in grotesque patterns on the walls. These aren't soldiers, Davies muttered to his team. They're animals. The Marines had seen combat across dozens of worlds. But there was something particularly disgusting about enemies who took pleasure in killing children. As they prepared to assault the building, Davies felt the cold fury that had carried him through years of war. The attack came without warning. The Ravok soldiers inside the nursery had been celebrating their latest kills when the walls literally exploded inward. The Marines came through the breach like a force of nature, their weapons speaking death in precise, controlled bursts. The battle was over in minutes, but the psychological impact would last much longer. Word spread quickly through the Ravok ranks that something terrible had come to Keth 7. The Cathari hadn't just called for help. They had summoned monsters. Warlord Kresh received the reports in his command ship orbiting high above the planet. His forces were describing impossible things, human soldiers who seemed to flow like water through urban terrain, who set traps with the patience of natural predators, who fought with a combination of technology and instinct that defied understanding. How? Many humans are there? Kresh demanded of his surviving patrol leaders. Unknown, my lord. They strike without warning and disappear before we can respond. They seem to be everywhere at once. Kresh studied the tactical display showing his forces' positions on the planet's surface. In the past 6 hours, he had lost 40% of his ground troops, and the humans hadn't even revealed their full strength yet. The Ravok had built their reputation on the systematic brutalization of peaceful species, always choosing targets that couldn't meaningfully resist. Now they were facing something that didn't just resist, it hunted back. Sir, his communications officer reported, we're receiving surrender requests from several of our ground units. They're requesting immediate evacuation. Kresh felt his blood run cold. The Ravok Syndicate had never retreated from a weaker enemy, and they had certainly never surrendered to anyone. But the humans weren't fighting like a weaker enemy. They were fighting like apex predators, who had been personally offended by the Ravok's treatment of the Cathari on the planet's surface. The Marines continued their systematic elimination of Ravok forces. They didn't just defeat their enemies. They studied them, learned their weaknesses, and exploited them with ruthless efficiency. The Ravok found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to understand warfare on a level they had never encountered before. Captain Brooks monitored the operation from his command center aboard the Retribution. The tactical display showed his forces moving through the city like a tide of death, systematically clearing each sector of Ravok presence. The enemy was being eliminated with an efficiency that would have impressed even the most hardened military commanders. Sir, his operations officer reported, we're receiving requests from the Cathari survivors. They want to know when the negotiation teams will arrive. Brooks looked at the display showing the systematic destruction of the Ravok forces. Tell them the negotiations are already underway. They're just not the kind of negotiations they expected. The Cathari had asked for aid workers and diplomats, for people who could talk to the Ravok and convince them to leave. Instead, they had received something far more effective: soldiers who understood that some problems could only be solved through the application of overwhelming force. The night wore on. The Ravok Syndicate began to understand that they had made a terrible mistake. They had expected to face a defenseless population, but instead they had awakened something that treated the protection of innocence as a sacred duty. The humans didn't negotiate with murderers, they eliminated them. The Cathari had called for help, and the predators who had answered their call were about to teach the galaxy that there were some species who would go to any lengths to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The Ravok had thought they were the apex predators in this part of the galaxy, but they were about to learn that there were monsters in the universe who hunted other monsters, and humanity was chief among them. Warlord Kresh had built his reputation on the systematic brutalization of peaceful species. For 30 years, the Ravok Syndicate had terrorized dozens of worlds, always choosing targets that couldn't meaningfully resist. They were the apex predators of this region of space, and the Cathari should have been just another easy conquest. Standing on the bridge of his flagship, Kresh watched the tactical display with growing unease. His ground forces were being systematically dismantled by an enemy that seemed to treat warfare as an art form. The humans didn't just fight. They hunted, using tactics that the Ravik had never encountered before. "Report," Kresh demanded of his surviving ground commanders. "My lord," came the shaky voice of Commander Vrak, "we have lost control of the northern sector. The humans move like ghosts through the ruins. They set traps, they use our own weapons against us, and they seem to know our movements before we make them." Kresh felt his scaled skin crawl. The Ravok were natural predators, evolved for hunting and killing. They had conquered dozens of worlds through superior firepower and ruthless tactics. But these humans fought with a combination of technology and instinct that seemed to flow from their very nature. "How many humans are there?" Kresh asked. "Unknown, my lord. They strike without warning and disappear before we can respond. We believe there are at least 1,000 of them, possibly more." Kresh studied the reports flowing in from across the planet. In 12 hours, he had lost 60% of his ground forces. The humans hadn't even revealed their full strength yet, and they were already winning. This was supposed to be a simple raid against a defenseless population, not a war against professional soldiers. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "we're receiving a transmission from the human fleet. Put it through." The main screen flickered to life, showing the face of Captain Brooks. The human looked tired, but there was something in his eyes that made Kresh's blood run cold. This wasn't the face of a negotiator or a diplomat. This was the face of a predator who had been personally offended by what he had found. "Warlord Kresh," Brooks said calmly, "I am Captain Brooks of the Terran, Colonial Marines. You have exactly 1 hour to withdraw all of your forces from Keth 7 and surrender for trial. If you refuse, we will consider you a threat to civilian populations and act accordingly." Kresh laughed, but the sound came out forced and hollow. "You think you can threaten the Ravik Syndicate? We have terrorized this region for decades. We are the apex predators of this space." Brooks' expression didn't change. "Warlord, you made a mistake when you decided to target civilians. The Cathari called for help, and we answered. You have 1 hour." The transmission ended, leaving Kresh staring at a blank screen. Around him, his bridge crew waited for orders, but the warlord found himself hesitating. The humans had spoken with the confidence of beings who had never lost a war, who treated violence as a tool to be used with surgical precision. "My lord," his tactical officer said nervously, "what are your orders?" Kresh looked at the tactical display one more time. His forces were being systematically eliminated by an enemy that seemed to understand warfare on a level the Ravik had never encountered. But retreat was not an option. The Ravik Syndicate had built its reputation on never backing down from a weaker enemy. "Prepare for orbital bombardment of the largest refugee camp," Kresh ordered. "If the humans want to protect the Cathari, let them watch their charges burn." The order was transmitted to the weapon stations, but the bombardment never came. Instead, alarms began blaring throughout the ship as emergency bulkheads sealed and the lights flickered to emergency power. "What's happening?" Kresh demanded. "Sir," the tactical officer reported, his voice rising in panic, "we have intruders on decks 7 through 12. They're moving toward the command center." Kresh felt his blood freeze. The humans had somehow managed to board his flagship without triggering any of the security systems. "How many?" "Unknown, sir." "They're jamming our internal sensors." The sounds of battle began echoing through the ship's corridors as the Ravik security forces tried to stop the intruders. But the sounds were wrong, too quick, too efficient, too final. The humans weren't fighting their way through the ship. They were systematically eliminating everyone in their path. Lieutenant Commander Ray led the boarding party through the Ravak command ship with the same precision his Marines had shown on the planet's surface. The Naval Special Operations troops moved like ghosts through the alien corridors, their advanced equipment allowing them to bypass the ship's security systems entirely. "Control, this is boarding team Alpha," Ray reported over the comm system. "We have secured the weapons systems. The orbital bombardment is offline." The Ravik crew they encountered fought with the desperate fury of trapped animals, but they were facing soldiers who had been trained for exactly this kind of operation. The humans moved with lethal efficiency, turning the ship's own corridors into a maze of death on the bridge. Kresh watched his tactical display as his own ship was systematically captured around him. The humans had infiltrated his flagship and were taking control of it from within. In 30 years of warfare, he had never encountered an enemy capable of such precision. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "we're receiving surrender requests from the other ships in the fleet. They're requesting permission to withdraw." Kresh felt his world collapsing around him. The Ravik Syndicate had never retreated. Never surrendered? Never backed down from any enemy? But these humans weren't just any enemy. They were something else entirely, creatures, who seemed to have been designed specifically for war. The bridge doors exploded inward in a shower of sparks and metal fragments. Lieutenant Commander Ray stepped through the breach, his weapon trained on Kresh's command staff. The other Marines followed, their movements coordinated with mechanical precision. "Warlord Kresh," Ray said calmly, "you are under arrest for crimes against civilian populations." Kresh reached for his sidearm, but Ray's weapon was already tracking his movement. "I am the warlord of the Ravik Syndicate. I do not surrender to anyone." "You're not surrendering," Ray replied. "You're being captured." The engagement was brief but decisive. When it ended, Kresh lay dead on his own bridge, and the Ravik fleet found itself without leadership. The surviving ships faced a simple choice: surrender or be destroyed. On the planet's surface, the remaining Ravik forces made their final stand in the ruins of the Cathari capital. They had hoped to use the city's surviving population as human shields, but they had fundamentally misunderstood. Their opponents, the humans, didn't negotiate with hostage-takers. They eliminated them. Captain Brooks coordinated the final assault from his command center, watching as his Marines systematically cleared the city of Ravik presence. The enemy had tried to use the Cathari civilians as protection, but the Marines had developed tactics specifically designed to deal with such situations. "Sir," his operations officer reported, "all Ravik forces have been eliminated. The city is secure." Brooks looked at the tactical display showing the complete destruction of the Ravik Syndicate. The pirates who had terrorized this region of space for decades had been eliminated in less than 24 hours. The humans had introduced them to a concept they had never encountered before: the idea that there were predators in the galaxy who hunted other predators. The Cathari had asked for aid workers and diplomats, for people who could negotiate with the Ravok and convince them to leave. Instead, they had received something far more effective: soldiers, who understood that some problems could only be solved through the complete elimination of those who caused them as the last Ravok. Stronghold fell, the surviving pirates began to understand what they had truly faced. These weren't just soldiers, they were the guardian angels of a species that had decided the protection of innocence was worth any price. The humans had shown them that there were monsters in the universe who would go to any lengths to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The Ravik Syndicate had thought they were the apex predators in this part of the galaxy, but they had learned too late that humanity was something far more dangerous, a species that had turned the protection of the innocent into a sacred duty and would eliminate anyone who threatened that principle. The crystal towers of Verdania City lay in ruins, but the killing had finally stopped. In the aftermath of the liberation, the Cathari survivors emerged from their hiding places to find a world transformed. The Ravik Syndicate had been completely eliminated, their ships destroyed or captured, their forces scattered to the winds. Elder Finn walked through the streets of his ruined city, accompanied by Captain Brooks and a small escort of Marines. The human soldiers moved with the same deadly precision they had shown during the battle, but now their weapons were lowered and their movements were careful not to frighten the traumatized civilians. "I still don't understand," Finn said quietly, his musical voice carrying a note of confusion. "We asked for humanitarian aid, for doctors and negotiators. Instead you sent soldiers. Why?" Brooks looked out over the crystalline landscape where Cathari civilians were beginning to emerge from hiding. Medical teams were setting up aid stations and engineers were assessing the damage to the city's infrastructure. The work of rebuilding had begun, but it would take years to restore what had been lost. Because sometimes, Brooks said carefully, the only way to save innocent lives is to take guilty ones. You needed protection, not negotiation. The Cathari had struggled to understand what had happened to them. Their peaceful culture had no concept of protective violence, no understanding of how warriors could be both destroyers and saviors. They had witnessed the complete annihilation of their tormentors, delivered by beings who seemed to embrace violence as a tool of compassion. But your people, Finn said, they killed without hesitation. They showed no mercy to the Ravik. How is that different from what our enemies were doing? Brooks stopped walking and turned to face the elderly alien. Elder, there's a difference between killing for pleasure and killing for protection. The Ravik murdered your people for entertainment. We eliminated the Ravik to save your people. The result might look the same, but the motivation makes all the difference. Across the city, the Marines were working alongside Cathari civilians to establish temporary shelters and medical facilities. The same soldiers who had hunted the Ravik through the ruins were now helping to care for the survivors. Their weapons set aside in favor of medical supplies and construction equipment. Sergeant Mills worked with a team of Cathari engineers to restore power to a residential sector. The gentle aliens watched in amazement as the scarred human soldier carefully repaired delicate crystal circuits with the same precision he had used to eliminate their enemies. You're very skilled, said Tam, a young Cathari engineer. Have you done this kind of work before? Mills smiled grimly. You learn a lot about fixing things when you spend your time breaking them. Besides, what good is winning a war if you can't help rebuild afterward? The Cathari had begun to understand that these humans were something unique in the galaxy. They were warriors who fought not for conquest or glory, but for the protection of those who couldn't protect themselves. They had introduced the Cathari to a concept their peaceful culture had never developed, the idea that sometimes the greatest act of compassion was the willingness to be ruthless toward those who preyed upon the helpless. Dr. Martin, the chief medical officer from the Retribution, worked in a makeshift hospital treating Cathari survivors. The gentle aliens required specialized care due to their crystalline biology, but the human medical team had quickly adapted their techniques to help the wounded. Your people, said Lin, a Cathari healer, they fight like demons, but they heal like angels. How do you reconcile such different natures? Martin looked up from the patient he was treating. We fight so hard because we care so much. Every life we save is worth every enemy we have to kill to save it. The philosophical implications of what had happened were beginning to sink in throughout Cathari society. They had always believed that violence was inherently evil, that all conflicts could be resolved through peaceful negotiation. The humans had shown them that there were times when violence became a moral necessity. When the refusal to fight was itself a form of evil, Elder Finn called a meeting of the surviving Cathari leadership to discuss what they had learned. The council met in the ruins of their ancient chamber, surrounded by the broken crystals that had once been symbols of their peaceful civilization. We have seen something today that challenges everything we believed about the nature of conflict, Finn began. These humans have shown us that there are beings in the galaxy who will kill to protect the innocent, who will embrace violence as a tool of justice. The other council members murmured among themselves. Some were disturbed by what they had witnessed, unable to reconcile their peaceful beliefs with the brutal efficiency of the human soldiers. Others were beginning to understand that their pacifist philosophy had left them defenseless against predators like the Ravik. Perhaps, said Elder Kev, one of the youngest council members, we have been naive about the nature of the galaxy. We assumed that our peaceful intentions would be respected by all species, but the Ravak showed us that there are those who see peace as weakness. The discussion continued for hours, but gradually a consensus began to emerge. The Cathari had learned something profound about the galaxy. There were species out there capable of protecting the innocent through the application of controlled violence. The humans had introduced them to a new way of thinking about conflict and protection. As the Retribution prepared to depart Keth 7, Delegations of Cathari survivors came to say goodbye to their saviors. They brought gifts of crystal artwork and offered formal thanks for the liberation of their world. But more importantly, they came with a request. "Captain Brooks," Elder Finn said formally, "the Cathari Council would like to establish formal diplomatic relations with the Terran colonial government. We have witnessed what your people can accomplish when innocents are threatened, and we want these dangerous, protective beings as allies." Brooks smiled for the first time since arriving at Keth 7. "Elder, I think that can be arranged. The Terran government is always interested in peaceful relations with species that share our values." The Marines began boarding their transports, but their departure was different from their arrival. When they had come to Keth 7, they had been grim warriors preparing for battle. Now they were departing as protectors who had successfully defended the innocent, their mission accomplished. Lieutenant Davies was among the last to board. As he prepared to leave, a group of young Cathari approached him with a question that had been troubling them. "Sir," said Nix, a Cathari child whose parents had been killed in the first bombardment, "will you come back if the bad ones return?" Davies knelt down to the child's level, his scarred face gentle. "Kid, if anyone ever threatens your people again, they'll have to go through us first. That's a promise." The implications of what had happened on Keth 7 began to spread throughout the galaxy as news of the Ravok Syndicate's destruction reached other worlds. The story that emerged was both inspiring and terrifying. A peaceful species had called for help, and predators had answered who were capable of eliminating an entire pirate organization in less than 24 hours. Other peaceful species began to take notice. The humans had demonstrated something that many had thought impossible, that violence could be used as a force for protection rather than destruction. That there were warriors in the galaxy who fought not for conquest but for justice. As the TCS Retribution jumped to hyperspace, leaving Keth 7 behind, the Cathari began the long process of rebuilding their civilization. But they also began something else, the establishment of a new philosophy that combined their peaceful nature with the understanding that sometimes peace could only be maintained through strength. The distress call had asked for aid workers and diplomats, for people who could negotiate with the Ravok and convince them to leave. Instead, the Cathari had received something far more valuable, protectors who understood that in a dangerous galaxy, the most humanitarian act was sometimes the willingness to be utterly inhuman to those who threatened the innocent. The galaxy had learned something important from the events at Keth 7. There were predators out there who hunted other predators, species who had made the protection of innocents into a sacred duty. The humans had shown that sometimes when you call for help, the monsters who answer are exactly the monsters you need. In the years that followed, the story of Keth 7 would become legend throughout known space. It was the story of how a peaceful people learned that there were guardians in the darkness, warriors who would go to any lengths to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. It was the story of how humanity had become the shield between the innocent and those who would prey upon them. The Cathari had asked for aid, but what they had received was something far more precious, the knowledge that they were not alone in a dangerous galaxy, that there were those who would fight and die to keep the light of civilization burning against the darkness of those who would extinguish it.